Okay, but just trust me, bear with me right now. Why this is better, clearly and identity. So Dorian is always the Dorian that way. We don't have to renumber it. No mental recalculation based on the parent key. It stops us from thinking that we have to memorize on the fretboard 12 times 7 scales just for the basic scales, and then every time they make a tweak to the scale, they pretend they're doing a completely different scale. It's like, no, you just added a half step to a normal diatonic scale. Stop pretending you made something totally, it's just this, I mean, you're making it hard. So modular thinking. So want to transpose Lydian phrase, just keep mode 4 and move the root. So again, all we have to do from a fretboard standpoint is say, I'm just going to make a new root. Now, there's a couple different ways that we can create the shape, derive the shape that we'll talk about. One is that you can just memorize the shape on the fretboard, and that would be like using a chord-based system, a caged system, memorizing the 5 shapes on the fretboard and so on. Another is that you can derive it by formula, which is what we typically do in music theory, and they do the same thing to the formula that they do with the scales, acting like we pretend like there's 7 different formulas to get to all the modes. But no, it's the same formula. You're just starting from different points. So that's the easier way to visualize it. You're starting from different points in the formula. So we'll get there. And then the next way to do it is by interval, meaning what's the distance if I look at a root note and I derive the distance of every other note from that root note. So we'll talk about that more in future presentations. Those become important because that's how you build your chords. That's how you think of your relationship between notes. But the naming conventions for those, that's the problematic thing. That's the thing we have to mull over and say, okay, how can we think about this a little bit better so I can communicate but still see pictorially, visually, shape-wise, modal-based. Math compatible, works seamlessly with spreadsheets. So once again, this works with spreadsheets and stuff, but don't let that fool you that I'm trying to tell you I'm doing this because I'm an accountant or something. It's like, no, look, it's easier to memorize the shape. And the fact that you can map it out more simply in Excel or some other database program is telling you that when you put it into Excel, you're actually making it easier on Excel. You're supposed to put things in Excel because there's a difficult calculation that you're trying to get Excel to do. But no, what you're actually doing is saying, hey, Excel, I would like you to look at it the easy way so that you can give me the answer to something while I'm over here thinking about it the more difficult way, right? Do you see what I mean? Your mind, we're programming our own minds in a way that's more difficult than we're asking the computer to do. If the language we're giving the computer is different and we're using normal language, not like ones and zeros to communicate with the computer, then it's an indication that we're not thinking about things as cleanly as possible, right? And if we think about things more cleanly, then we can focus on the art side of music and less on switching the names of all the notes to different relative numbering systems and so on. So enable quick computation. So mode formula equals a fixed structure. Transposition equals simple addition shift. So we'll talk more about that later. Better for visualization, especially on guitar. Fixed fretboard shapes for each mode. You always know where mode 5 Mixolydian lands. So if I have, this is my shape again. Notice this is all the keys and all the notes in the key of C and whatnot. So notice if I'm moving from a C over here, I would make a bar chord. So we'll talk about this more later, but if you know the cage system, you're gonna say, okay, normally, if I'm trying to play a C, I'm gonna make a bar chord, which would be here, boom, boom, these two, and then this. So I'd bar this off and play this. But if I move to a G, then if I go to the G down here, you can see you can also bar this off and call it like a G major. But you see the problem here is with our normal convention, this isn't a G major. If this is the one, if I'm looking at C major and related modes, I want to call this the Ionian mode even when I switch chords, so right, this is the major chord, and when I go over here, I don't want to call this another major chord, right? I want to say that this is the 5 chord, which is a mixolydian chord. And you're going to say, well, it has all the same notes if I call it a major chord. Yes, it does, but look at the shape around it. The shape around it is different than the shape around this one, right? It's similar, but it's different. So see what I'm doing, what I have to do if in my mind, if I say, well, I'm going from a major chord to a major chord, and I'm forced to renumber this as though it's a major chord, is I'm going to imagine the shape around here to be exactly the shape as this shape. It's not. It's different. I want to recognize the difference in the shape. I'm going to the 1 chord or the Ionian chord to the 5 chord or the Mixolydian chord, which, if I think about it from a caged system, a shaped system, a 5-shaped system of the fretboard, I want to identify this as the Mixolydian shape. Right, and so that's the problem with our current naming convention. It's forcing us to think of this kind of like as it's the major shape, and it's not. So if I start to learn, so that's why you want to learn the actual nodes in the system, like the Knights of the Round Table, and know their name without having to change their name. And then learn the relationships between all of the Knights on the Round Table, the distances between them, and then we'll deal with the naming conventions that's going to mess us up to do that, which messes people up. So let me just show you the problem here. If you learn this way, if you're a caged learner and you learn the shapes, how they move up the fretboard, you will end up being able to play well. But then people are going to say, well, he's not sophisticated because you can't communicate. You're not talking. You're just talking in terms of shapes, right? You're not telling me. You don't even know what the distance is interval-wise between this and that and the other thing. And that's because, and there might be some truth to that, but that's because the naming convention is forcing us out of the natural way that we want to learn the guitar. So oftentimes, guitar players are kind of notorious for not being sophisticated with their communication of music theory, right? Because we learn shapes and we're just moving the shapes up or visualizing the fretboard because that's the natural way to do it. And because the music theory is taking us out of the natural way that would be best to visualize the fretboard, which would be from a caged system or some other kind of visualization system. The language doesn't have to be different. It should line up, right? And if we use nodes, it does. It lines up. Okay, that doesn't mean we still have to bridge it with normal communication to think in relative positions. That's the challenge. That's what we'll get into in future presentations. So notice that historically, why has this happened? Well, musical theory was built around chant system. So it started, obviously, our vocal cords are kind of like the starting point of us thinking about music. So no numerical system. Everything was based on letter names. And then, of course, we have the piano, which is a beautiful instrument set up. But we talked about before that they set it up to play, easily within one key, which they happened to pick to be the key of C, which made us back into the full 12-note system, which made us kind of then back into our scale system, which might not be the optimal way, even for the piano, to now learn. Notice if you're on a piano, then you still have the same issue. A mode-based system, I still argue, would be better because it's going to overcome the problems with the piano, which is this perspective problem. Like the C major scale is better than all the other scales and whatnot because that's how the thing is kind of laid out. But also if you're in the key of C major on all the white keys, you still end up with the same problem of going from the 1 to the 4 to the 5 and then having to rename the Knights of the Round Table within the system. It's easier to do on the piano, however, because you only have one set of keys in one linear progression. So it doesn't take as much cognitive ability, although it still takes plenty, whereas on a guitar, you have a grid structure, and therefore it takes a whole lot more cognitive ability to rename the grid every time you're moving from one thing to the other. So that's why on the guitar, it's much more important, but on the piano, still, it works. On the piano, you'd have to learn 12 different master keys because of the non-symmetry of the black keys. But it's not 12 times 7, because within those 12 different kind of shapes, I would be thinking in a modal system. That's what I would argue to do, rather than 7 relative positions within all of the 12 keys. All right. All other theory was based around white keys and diatonic scale assumptions.